For a dog trained to face danger, Valor's fear was inexplicable. On the secluded land that was supposed to be their sanctuary, the German Shepherd refused to go near one particular hillside, his body trembling, a low whimper in his throat. Trusting his partner's instincts over the deceptive peace of the mountains, Jake began to investigate. But the truth was not just a buried object. It was a conspiracy that had already claimed lives. He quickly realized that his sanctuary was actually a hunting ground, and the local sheriff was not there to protect him, but to ensure he would become the next victim. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The old Ford rattled its protest as the road narrowed and climbed, shedding asphalt for gravel like a snake shedding its skin. Jake kept a steady hand on the wheel, his knuckles pale against the worn leather. For the last hour, the world had been shrinking, the sky reduced to a narrow ribbon of blue between the dense canopies of oak and hickory. Here, in the deep folds of the Appalachian Mountains, civilization felt like a distant memory, a bad dream from which he was finally waking. Beside him, Valor sat motionless, a statue of regal alertness. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, a magnificent animal whose coat was a rare blend of silver gray and white, making him look more like a creature of the wild mountains than a domesticated dog. His intelligent amber eyes watched the passing trees, his sharp ears twitching at the alien sounds of the forest. He was Jake's anchor, the steady, breathing presence that kept the ghosts of the past at bay. Jake reached over, his hand settling on the thick fur of Valor's neck. The dog leaned into the touch, a low rumble of contentment in his chest. No words were needed. Their bond was forged in the silent, screaming nights of a field hospital and tempered in the quiet desperation of the years that followed. Valor understood the tremors in Jake's hands before they started. Jake understood the subtle shift in Valor's posture that signaled a change in the world around them. He was a man seeking silence. At 35, Jake wore the landscape of his past on his face. He was tall and lean, with a wiry strength that his faded flannel shirt couldn't hide. His brown hair, cut short in the marine style he'd never abandoned, was showing silver at the temples. His face, etched with lines of hardship, held a kindness in the eyes that hadn't been extinguished by the things they had seen. He was a former sergeant, a decorated veteran, and a man running on the fumes of hope. That hope was invested entirely in a piece of paper in his glove box, the deed to 40 acres of forgotten land in Blue Ridge County, North Carolina. It had been a fluke. A property seized for back taxes, sold at a public auction online. The price was so low it felt like a mistake. Jake had poured the last of his disability pay and savings into the bid, his heart hammering against his ribs until the confirmation email arrived. 40 acres of trees, rock, and solitude. A place to build a wall against the world, not with bricks and mortar, but with silence and distance. The gravel track ended abruptly in a small clearing. A simple, single-story cabin stood before them, its wooden walls weathered to a soft gray, a stone chimney standing sentinel at one end. It wasn't much, but it was solid. It was his. "Well, boy," Jake said, his voice raspy from disuse. "We're home." He cut the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. It was a living thing, textured with the hum of insects and the whisper of a breeze through the pines. It was the sound he had been chasing across 3 states. Jake closed his eyes, breathing it in. For the first time in years, the frantic noise in his own head seemed to quiet, subdued by the profound peace of the mountains. Valor nudged his hand with a wet nose, whining softly. It was time. They spent the first hour exploring the perimeter of their new world. Jake walked with a long, ground-eating stride, his worn work boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Valor trotted at his side, tail held high, his nose working constantly as he cataloged a library of new smells. The property was a mix of rolling hills and dense woods, with a small, clear stream cutting through the southern edge. It was perfect. More than perfect. It was a sanctuary. But as they approached the western boundary, a steep, wooded hillside that rose sharply toward a rocky outcrop, Valor changed. The confident trot slowed to a hesitant walk. His tail lowered, and the fur along his spine bristled slightly. He stopped dead, a low whine escaping his throat. "What is it, Val?" Jake asked, stopping beside him. He scanned the hillside, his eyes, trained to spot anomalies, seeing nothing but trees and shadows. There was no sound, no scent on the wind that he could detect. Valor backed away a step, his ears flat against his skull. He looked up at Jake, his amber eyes filled with a definite and unsettling anxiety. He would not go any further in that direction. Jake had seen the dog face down, snarling strays, and walk calmly through fireworks displays that sent other animals into a panic. This was different. This was a deep, instinctual rejection of the place. "Okay," Jake said softly, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Okay, boy, we'll leave it be." He trusted the dog without question. If Valor said the hillside was wrong, then it was wrong. They turned back toward the cabin, but a sliver of unease had pierced the bubble of Jake's newfound peace. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, Jake started unloading the truck. He set a cooler and a box of supplies on the porch. The simple act of creating a home sending a small current of satisfaction through him. Valor, having shaken off his earlier mood, was sniffing around the edge of the clearing, near a patch of overgrown weeds that might have once been a garden. Suddenly, the dog went rigid. His playful exploration ceased, replaced by a singular, intense focus. He lowered his head to the ground, his nose twitching rapidly over a small patch of dirt and sparse grass. Jake paused, watching him. This was not the casual curiosity of a dog chasing a field mouse. This was the precise, methodical behavior of a highly trained animal on a scent. Valor began to whine again, a different sound this time, a high-pitched note of urgency. He looked back at Jake, then back at the ground, and began to scratch at the earth with his front paws. Dirt flew as he dug with a frantic energy, his entire body trembling with focus. Jake set down the box he was holding and walked over, his boots crunching on dry leaves. "Easy, boy. What'd you find?" Valor ignored him. He continued to dig, his purpose absolute. Jake knelt, pushing the dog gently aside. He looked at the disturbed patch of ground. It was just dirt and roots. But Valor's insistence was undeniable. In all their years together, the dog's instincts had never been wrong. They had kept him alive more than once. A cold knot formed in Jake's stomach, a familiar feeling he had hoped to leave behind forever. The perfect, silent sanctuary he had bought for a bargain already held a secret. And his partner, his anchor in the storm of the world, was telling him that secret was buried right beneath their feet. He stood up and walked back to his truck, the silence of the mountains no longer feeling peaceful, but watchful. He pulled a folding shovel from his gear. Whatever was down there, Valor was adamant it should not stay hidden. And Jake knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was about to dig up the very trouble he had come here to escape. The shovel bit into the earth with a dull thud. Jake worked with a steady, efficient rhythm, a cadence born from digging countless fighting positions in landscapes far less forgiving than this. Valor sat nearby, his body a tense coil of anticipation, watching every spadeful of dirt that was tossed aside. The sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the small clearing in shifting patterns of light and shadow. After a few minutes of determined digging, the shovel struck something hard, with a jarring scrape of metal on metal. Not a rock. The sound was hollow, artificial. Jake's breath caught. He knelt, setting the shovel aside and using his hands to clear the remaining soil. His fingers brushed against a cold, rusted surface. Carefully, he worked the object free from the grip of the earth and roots. It was a small metal lockbox, no bigger than a shoebox, its surface pitted and brown with corrosion. It was surprisingly heavy, sealed tight by the years of moisture. He carried it to the porch, Valor trotting silently at his heels. Using the pry bar from his toolkit, Jake forced the rusted latch. The lid groaned open with a shriek of tortured metal. Inside, resting on a bed of what was once cloth, lay two items. The first was a dog collar, its leather cracked and faded, the metal buckle green with age. The second was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages swollen and warped by the damp. Jake sat on the top step of the porch, the box resting between his boots. He picked up the journal, its cover cool and slightly slimy to the touch. With a gentle thumb, he carefully fanned the pages open, a musty smell of wet paper and decay rising from them. Much of the ink had bled, rendering the entries into illegible blue clouds. But near the middle, one page had been better protected. On it, a single entry was circled, written with a frantic, heavy pen. "I have left everything under the old oak with the lightning scar." Jake read the words twice, a frown creasing his brow. He looked at the box, at the journal in his hand. If this was the everything the author was referring to, then the note made no sense. He scanned the clearing. The trees here were mostly pine and maple. There was no great oak, and certainly none bearing the mark of a lightning strike. Valor had found this box here, of that he was certain, but the box itself was pointing him somewhere else. It was a clue, and a contradiction. Before he could ponder it further, the sound of an engine broke the forest's silence. A white pickup truck with the official seal of Blue Ridge County on its door was making its way slowly up his gravel driveway. It parked behind his own Ford, and a man in a crisp sheriff's uniform stepped out. He was in his mid-50s, a big man who filled out his uniform well. His hair was thick and silver white, and his face was a roadmap of sun and laugh lines. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who owned his space, and he wore a smile that was broad and welcoming. But as he drew closer, Jake saw that the smile never quite touched the man's eyes, which were a pale, cold blue. "Afternoon," the man boomed, his voice friendly. "Just wanted to come by and welcome you to the county. Name's Thompson, Sheriff Bill Thompson. It's strike." Jake stood up, placing himself subtly in front of the open lockbox. Valor, who had been lying down, rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He didn't bark or bristle, but he stood at Jake's side like a gray shadow, his body perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the newcomer. "Jake Brooks," Jake replied, giving a short nod. "Appreciate you stopping by, Sheriff." "No trouble at all. We don't get many new folks out this far," Thompson said, his eyes scanning the property, taking in the cabin, the truck, and Jake himself. "It's a beautiful piece of land, but it's got its stories, you could say." Jake waited, his face impassive. "Old-timers say strange things happen in these woods," the sheriff continued, his tone shifting to that of a folksy storyteller. "Some say it's old Cherokee spirits. Others say it's the ghosts of moonshiners from back in the day. Strange lights, sounds on the wind when there's no breeze. The folks who owned this place before you, they were city people, left in a hurry. Guess the quiet was a little too loud for them." Jake recognized the technique instantly. It was a soft probe, a psychological tool used to gauge a person's resolve, to plant a seed of doubt and fear under the guise of local lore. He'd seen it used by interrogators overseas. The intent was the same: to make the target uncomfortable, to discourage them from digging any deeper. The sheriff's friendly act was a warning. "I've heard my share of stories, Sheriff," Jake said, his voice level. "The quiet is what I came for." Thompson's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. He had expected a different reaction. "Well, that's good to hear. Just thought I'd give you the neighborly heads up. It's best not to go poking around too much. Easy to get lost in these mountains." Throughout the entire exchange, Valor remained a silent statue of distrust. The dog never took his eyes off Thompson. A low, guttural vibration, too quiet for the sheriff to hear, rumbled in his chest. It was a growl felt more than heard, a clear and absolute signal of a perceived threat. Jake rested a hand on the dog's head, the gesture both a command to stand down and a silent acknowledgement. "I see it too, boy." "I'll keep that in mind," Jake said. Sheriff Thompson gave a final, hearty nod. "All right then, Mr. Brooks. You need anything, you know who to call." He turned and walked back to his truck, the friendly facade perfectly in place. Jake watched until the truck disappeared down the driveway, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the air. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, charged with unspoken threats. The sheriff's visit had done the opposite of what he intended. It had taken Jake's sliver of unease and forged it into the hard steel of certainty. Something was deeply wrong with this place, and Sheriff Thompson was part of it. He looked down at the open box, at the journal, and the collar. Relics of the predecessor. Relics of a man who likely hadn't just been spooked. Jake picked up the journal, his mission now clear. He turned to his partner. "All right, Val. Let's go find a tree." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees as Jake and Valor searched. For more than an hour, they had walked a methodical grid pattern through the eastern section of the property, Jake's eyes scanning the trunks of the ancient trees, looking for the telltale scar of a lightning strike. The journal was tucked securely in his jacket pocket, its cryptic message a heavy weight. He found dozens of oaks, some massive and ancient, but none bore the distinctive mark. Frustration began to prick at the edges of his concentration. Valor seemed to sense his mood, staying close, his usual exploratory sniffing replaced by a quiet, watchful presence. The dog understood the shift in their mission. This was no longer a peaceful exploration. It was a search. Just as Jake was about to call it a day and head back to the cabin, the sound echoed through the valley again. An engine. Different from the sheriff's truck, a higher-pitched hum. Instinct took over. "Valor, heel," Jake commanded in a low voice. The dog was instantly at his left side. Jake moved silently behind the broad trunk of a poplar, his body melting into the shadows. His heart hammered a familiar, controlled rhythm against his ribs. The visit from the sheriff had put every nerve on high alert. He was exposed out here, and he had no idea who was coming or why. He watched as a dusty, dark green SUV bumped its way up the driveway and parked near the cabin. The engine cut, and the mountain's profound silence returned for a moment before a car door opened and closed. A woman emerged. She stood for a moment, surveying the clearing with a sharp, intelligent gaze. She was perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore sturdy jeans, hiking boots, and a worn denim jacket, looking less like a casual visitor and more like someone who had come with a purpose. Her face was tense, with a mixture of determination and weary sorrow. Jake remained hidden, observing. He watched her walk up to the cabin's porch, her movements deliberate. She wasn't here by accident. When she raised a hand to knock, he decided to act. "Can I help you?" he called out, his voice firm. The woman startled, spinning around to face the direction of his voice. Her eyes, wide and searching, finally found him as he stepped out from behind the tree. She didn't look scared, only surprised. "I'm looking for Jake Brooks," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The new owner of this property." "You found him," Jake replied, not moving any closer. Valor remained at his side, a silent, gray statue of potential force. "Not a lot of visitors out this way? First the sheriff, now you." The woman's expression hardened slightly at the mention of the sheriff. "I'm not here by chance, Mr. Brooks. My name is Sarah. Sarah Jensen." She took a few steps forward, her hands visible. "I've been monitoring the sale records for this property since my brother disappeared here a year ago." Jake's guarded posture didn't change, but her words cut through his suspicion. Disappeared. The word hung in the cool air, far more ominous than the sheriff's folksy ghost stories. Still, he remained wary. "What's that got to do with me?" "My brother was the previous owner," she said, her voice cracking for the first time, revealing the deep well of pain beneath her determined exterior. "His name was Daniel. The police report says he abandoned the property. Sheriff Thompson told me he probably just got tired of the isolation and moved on. I don't believe him." Jake thought of the lockbox, the journal, the collar. He thought of Valor's fear on the hillside and his absolute distrust of the sheriff. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Because Daniel wasn't the type to just leave. He was an environmental activist. He believed a local company was using these remote lands to illegally dump chemical waste, poisoning the groundwater. This property was his base of operations. He was gathering proof. Her eyes locked onto his. He wouldn't just walk away from a fight like that, and he would never, ever have left his dog behind. The word hung in the air between them. Dog. Jake's suspicion was rapidly crumbling, replaced by a dawning sense of connection, of being part of a story that had started long before he arrived. He still hesitated, the ingrained habit of trusting no one dying hard. Sarah seemed to understand. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone, her movements slow and deliberate. She swiped the screen and turned it toward him. This was his dog, she said quietly. His name was Leo. Jake took a step forward to look at the screen. The photograph showed a smiling young man with kind eyes, his arm thrown around a handsome German shepherd. The dog in the picture was black and tan, but around its neck was a worn leather collar. A collar with a distinctive hand-tooled pattern on it. A collar that was, without any doubt, identical to the one currently sitting on the porch of his cabin. The final wall of his distrust collapsed. The story was real. The danger was real. As Jake stared at the photo, processing the irrefutable link, Valor did something unexpected. The dog, who had been standing rigidly at attention, took a hesitant step forward. He let out a soft whine. He approached Sarah cautiously, his head lowered as he sniffed her outstretched hand. Sarah stood perfectly still, her breath held. After a long moment, Valor's tense body relaxed. He nudged her hand with his nose, and the tip of his tail gave a single, tentative wag. He looked back at Jake, a clear question in his amber eyes, but the threat was gone from his posture. He had sensed the grief and sincerity in her, and he had judged her to be a friend. That was all the confirmation Jake needed. He trusted his dog's judgment more than his own. He gave a slow nod, the weight of his isolation suddenly lifting, replaced by the heavier burden of a shared mission. "My dog's name is Valor," Jake said, finally, "and I think you should come inside. There's something I need to show you." The rustic cabin was small, with only a main room and a small bedroom, but it was clean. Jake offered Sarah a seat at the simple wooden table while he placed the metal box upon it. The air filled with the musty scent of damp earth and old secrets. Valor, after his initial friendly greeting, now lay quietly by the hearth, his head on his paws, though his watchful eyes missed nothing. "This is what I found," Jake said, pushing the box, the collar, and the journal toward her. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the collar. She ran a thumb over the cracked leather, her expression a mixture of profound grief and fierce resolve. "Leo," she whispered. "Daniel made this for him. He was so proud of the pattern." She looked up at Jake, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He would never have left him. Never. That single, heartfelt statement solidified their alliance more than any contract could. They were no longer just a veteran and a journalist. They were partners in a search for truth. For the next hour, they hunched over the journal. The damp pages were delicate, and many were ruined, but some entries were still legible. Daniel's handwriting was a neat, scientific script detailing his observations of the local ecosystem. He wrote of a specific stream on the property, noting the declining number of frogs and fish. He had recorded pH levels that were dangerously acidic, and mentioned a strange, oily sheen that would appear on the water's surface after a heavy rain. "He was closing in on the source," Sarah said, her finger tracing a hand-drawn map of the property. The stream was clearly marked. "He writes here that the contamination grew stronger the further upstream he went, but the trail just stops. The last entry is just a set of coordinates, with a question mark next to them. And all. Then that's where we start," Jake said, his voice grim. They set out 20 minutes later, equipped with shovels, sample bags Sarah had in her vehicle, and a shared sense of grim purpose. The stream was easy to find, a narrow ribbon of water that gurgled over smooth stones as it wound its way through a grove of ferns and hemlock. To the untrained eye, it was a picture of natural beauty. But with Daniel's notes as their guide, they began to see the subtle signs of sickness. Sarah pointed out a sickly brown algae clinging to the rocks that shouldn't have been there. Jake noticed the unnatural quiet, the distinct lack of birdsong, or the chatter of squirrels in this particular section of the woods. The life that should have been teeming here was muted, suppressed. They followed the stream upward, the terrain growing steeper. They checked the coordinates from the journal, a spot just off the main creek, but found nothing. The ground was undisturbed. There was no sign of dumping, no obvious source for the poison that was clearly bleeding into the water. "It doesn't make sense," Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. "The readings were strongest here. The source has to be nearby." Jake scanned the surrounding woods, his military training kicking in. He looked for tracks, for broken branches, for anything out of place. But the forest kept its secrets well. The trail had gone cold. It was then that Valor, who had been trotting slightly ahead, began to act strangely. He had been sniffing the air the entire time, a low whine occasionally rumbling in his chest. Now he stopped. He lifted his nose high, testing the breeze, his body quivering. Then, with a new and urgent sense of direction, he veered away from the stream, heading toward a gentle slope covered in weeds and strangely barren-looking soil. "Valor?" Jake called. The dog ignored him. He was on a mission. Jake and Sarah exchanged a look and followed. Valor led them about 50 yards from the stream to a patch of ground that looked no different from any other. But here, his behavior became frantic. He began sniffing at the dirt in a tight circle, his whining growing louder, more insistent. "What is it, boy?" Jake knelt beside him. He could smell nothing but damp earth and decaying leaves. Valor pawed at the ground, then looked at Jake and let out a single, sharp bark. It was not a sound of excitement or aggression. It was a command. "Dig. Here." "I don't understand," Sarah said. "There's nothing here." "He's a trained service animal," Jake said, his trust in his partner absolute. "He's trained for scent detection. If he says there's something here, there's something here." He took his shovel and drove it into the barren soil. The first few spadefuls revealed nothing but dirt and rocks. Sarah watched, her arms crossed, her expression doubtful. But Jake kept digging, fueled by his faith in Valor. The dog stood by, whining with impatience, urging him on. Then the shovel hit something with a dull, hollow thud. Jake's heart began to pound. He dug faster, scraping the dirt away. A curved, rusted metal surface began to appear. It was dark green, almost black in the shadows of the woods. He cleared more soil, and Sarah let out a gasp. A faded logo, a stylized letter C, inside a hexagon, was just visible beneath the corrosion. As Jake cleared the earth from around the top of the barrel, a thick, acrid odor, sharp and sickeningly sweet, finally reached them. It was the smell of industrial solvents, a chemical perfume of death. He could see a dark, oily stain spreading into the soil from a corroded seam near the top of the drum. They had found it. This was not a remnant from the past. It was fresh enough to still be leaking its poison into the earth, into the water, into the lifeblood of the mountain. They stared at the unearthed barrel, the first piece of irrefutable, ugly truth in a conspiracy of silence. The poison trail had ended here, in this shallow, unmarked grave, and they both knew, with a terrifying certainty, that whoever had buried this barrel would not hesitate to bury anyone who uncovered it. The acrid smell of chemicals hung heavy in the air, a sickening perfume that clung to the back of the throat. Sarah worked quickly, her journalist instincts taking over. She photographed the rusted barrel from every angle, capturing the faded logo, the dark, oily stain seeping into the soil, and the discolored earth around it. Each click of her phone's camera felt like a small act of defiance. Jake stood guard, his eyes constantly scanning the dense woods around them. The peaceful sanctuary he had sought was gone, replaced by a hostile territory. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like an approaching threat. He was a soldier again, operating behind enemy lines. His only objective was to protect the asset, and right now, that was Sarah and the evidence she was gathering. Valor stood beside him, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest, his gaze fixed on the shadows between the trees. "We have to cover this back up," Jake said, his voice a low command. "Exactly as it was. We can't let them know we found it." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "I have enough. Let's go." They worked together, shoveling the tainted earth back into the hole, carefully replacing the top layer of leaves and debris. When they were finished, the site looked almost undisturbed, but they knew what lay beneath. They carried the knowledge like a physical weight on their shoulders as they walked back to the cabin, the silence between them thick with unspoken fear. The woods no longer felt empty. They felt watchful. They were in the cabin, discussing their next move, when the sound of an engine returned. It was the familiar rumble of the sheriff's truck. "He's back," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "Stay calm," Jake said, his own body tensing. "We haven't done anything. We're just a new landowner and his visitor." He moved to the door, opening it just as Sheriff Thompson was stepping onto the porch. Valor was at his side in an instant, his stance overtly hostile now, a deep growl audible in his throat. The sheriff's friendly smile was gone, replaced by a hard, impatient mask. His cold blue eyes flicked from Jake to Sarah, then to the shovels leaning against the porch rail, a faint trace of damp earth still clinging to them. "See, you've got company, Brooks," Thompson said. His voice was flat, all pretense of folksy charm stripped away. "And you've been busy." "Just clearing a new garden patch," Jake replied evenly, his face a neutral mask. Thompson took a slow step closer, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered sidearm. Valor's growl deepened, and Jake placed a steadying hand on his back. "That's funny," the sheriff said, his gaze as sharp as broken glass. "Because from the main road, it looked like your guest's vehicle was parked here for quite a while, and you were both headed up toward the old ridgeline. That area is restricted county land, unstable ground. It's a forbidden zone, for your own safety, of course." The veneer of legality was paper thin, and they all knew it. "We were just exploring the property line," Sarah interjected, her voice stronger than she felt. "Making sure we knew the boundaries." Hez?" Thompson's eyes settled on her, and for the first time, she felt the full force of his menace. "Ma'am, folks who don't respect boundaries around here tend to find themselves in trouble. Accidents happen in the mountains all the time. People get lost, they slip and fall. It would be a real shame if a couple of curious people like yourselves had an accident." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a cold, hard promise. Jake felt a familiar rage begin to build inside him, the controlled fire of a soldier facing down a tyrant. But he knew that reacting now would be a fatal mistake. He had to be smarter. "We appreciate the concern, Sheriff," Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We'll be sure to stay on our own land from now on." Thompson held his gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills playing out on the porch of the small cabin. Finally, the sheriff gave a tight, humorless smile. "See that you do." He turned without another word and strode back to his truck, leaving a palpable chill in his wake. They watched him drive away, the silence he left behind more threatening than his words. "We have to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We have to take this to the state police, someone outside his jurisdiction." "You're right," Jake agreed. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap. "Let's go. Now." They wasted no time. Sarah grabbed her bag, Jake secured the lockbox and journal, and they headed for her SUV, Valor sticking close to their heels. Their hope was a fragile flame in the growing darkness. Get to the nearest town, find a real cop, and expose Thompson before he could follow through on his threat. But as they reached the vehicle, the flame of hope was extinguished. Sarah stopped short, a choked cry escaping her lips. Jake saw it at the same time, and a cold dread washed over him. The front driver's side tire was completely flat, the rubber sagging against the gravel. He quickly walked around the vehicle. The other three were the same. It wasn't a random puncture. He knelt and ran his fingers along the sidewall of one tire. A long, clean slice ran through the thick rubber, a professional and deliberate act of sabotage. They were trapped. Miles from the nearest paved road, with no vehicle, no cell service, and a hunter who wore the local badge of law and order. The sheriff's shadow had fallen over them, and in the profound, watchful silence of the Appalachian Mountains, they were utterly and completely alone. Panic was a cold, sharp spike in Sarah's chest. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice thin, her gaze fixed on the useless flattened tires. "We're trapped." Jake's face was grim, but his eyes were clear and focused. The initial shock had passed, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of a soldier assessing a combat situation. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. He looked at the surrounding woods, then back at the cabin. "No, we're not trapped," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of fear. "We're cornered. There's a difference." He met her eyes, and she saw a flicker of the Marine he once was. A trapped animal waits. A cornered one fights back. "Fight back with what?" she asked, gesturing at their isolation. "He's the law." "He's a criminal with a badge," Jake corrected. "And criminals make mistakes. His mistake was thinking we'd be scared enough to sit here and wait for one of his accidents to happen." He looked toward the mountains. "He expects us to try and walk out, or to hide in the cabin. We're going to do the one thing he doesn't expect. We're going on the offensive." He didn't mean with weapons. He meant with knowledge. Their only power lay in the truth, and their only path forward was to uncover the full extent of Thompson's operation. The single barrel was evidence, but the main facility, the source, was the key. "Your brother was looking for the heart of it," Jake said to Sarah. "We're going to find it." Hope, fragile but fierce, pushed back against Sarah's fear. She nodded. "How?" Jake looked down at Valor, who was watching him intently, sensing the shift in strategy. "We let the expert take the lead." He knelt in front of the German shepherd, looking him directly in the eye. "Okay, boy. No more games. You know the smell. The poison." He tapped his own nose. "Find the source. Find it." Valor let out a short, sharp bark of understanding. He had his orders. They moved out not as victims, but as hunters. They didn't head for the road, but plunged deeper into the woods, with Valor leading the way. The dog moved with a new, relentless purpose, his nose sometimes to the ground, sometimes sampling the air. He wasn't just tracking a scent. He was following an invisible river of poison that flowed through the forest. He led them on a winding path, back toward the western edge of the property, toward the one place he had refused to go on their first day. The steep, imposing hillside. As they drew closer, Jake could see the dog's posture change. The fur on his neck rose slightly, and a low whine returned to his throat. But this time, he did not stop. He pushed through his fear, driven by Jake's command. He led them to a spot high on the densely wooded slope, an area thick with thorny underbrush and shadowed by ancient trees. It was a place no one would ever go by chance. Valor stopped abruptly in front of a massive rhododendron bush, its thick leaves forming a nearly solid wall of green. He began to whine loudly, pawing at the ground at the base of the bush. "He's found it," Sarah breathed. "Help me with this," Jake said. Together, they pulled at the heavy branches of the rhododendron. It was tougher than it looked, its roots deep and tangled. As they finally bent the main trunk aside, they saw why. It had been intentionally planted there, its roots growing over and around their target, forming a living lock. And beneath it, concealed by a layer of expertly applied dirt and moss, was the dull, gray glint of steel. Valor began digging furiously, his paws sending earth flying. Jake and Sarah joined in, using their hands to clear the remaining debris. What they revealed stole their breath. It was a heavy, reinforced steel hatch, like the door to a bunker, with a large, wheel-like handle in the center. It was so perfectly camouflaged that they would have walked right over it 100 times and never known it was there. The gates of hell, hidden in a place of beauty. Jake's eyes immediately went into a tactical scan. "Wait," he whispered, putting a hand on Sarah's arm. Don't touch it yet. His gaze swept the area. High in an ancient oak tree just above them, he saw it. A small, dark shape that didn't belong. An old, weather-beaten security camera, its lens a single, dead eye pointed directly at the hatch. "Stay behind me and don't make a sound," he instructed. He moved like a phantom, using the trees as cover, circling around until he was in the camera's blind spot directly beneath it. He shimmied up the rough bark of the tree. A single, thin black wire ran down the trunk, partially hidden by ivy. With a quick, clean cut from his utility knife, the eye was blinded. He slid back down to the ground. One down. He approached the hatch again, but Valor stopped him. The dog stood about 10 feet from the door, refusing to move closer, his gaze fixed on a patch of empty air between two trees. He let out a low, guttural growl. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Jake trusted the dog implicitly. He knelt, his eyes at Valor's level, trying to see what the dog saw. Nothing. He picked up a handful of fine, dry dirt. With a gentle underhand toss, he threw it into the space where Valor was staring. The dust hung in the air for a moment, and for a split second they both saw it. Two perfectly straight, thin, black lines, where the dust was disturbed by invisible beams of light. An infrared sensor fence. A silent, invisible tripwire. "Good boy, Val," Jake whispered, his heart pounding with adrenaline and pride. The dog had just saved them from announcing their presence to whatever was inside. He followed the faint hum of the emitters to a small, poorly hidden junction box nailed to the base of a pine tree. The wiring was amateurish. A few snips with his knife, and the invisible fence was gone. They were in. Thanks to a soldier's training and a dog's extraordinary senses, Jake put his hands on the cold steel wheel of the hatch. He looked at Sarah, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a firm, determined nod. With a deep breath, he put all his weight into turning it. The mechanism groaned in protest, the sound of metal grinding on rusted metal echoing in the silent woods. The gates of hell were opening. With a final, collective grunt of effort, Jake and Sarah heaved the heavy steel hatch open. It settled onto the surrounding dirt with a dull, final thud. A wave of cold, stale air washed over them, carrying an overwhelming chemical stench that was far more concentrated than the smell from the single unearthed barrel. It was the smell of decay on an industrial scale. Jake pulled a small, powerful flashlight from his jacket. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice low. Valor whined, pressing against his leg, the dog's instinct screaming at him to flee this unnatural place. "With me, Val," Jake said, and the dog's loyalty overrode his fear. He followed his master into the darkness. The beam of the flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a steep flight of concrete stairs descending into the earth. They moved down cautiously, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The air grew colder, and the chemical smell became so thick it was almost a taste. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a vast, cavernous space. It was a nightmare carved from the heart of the mountain. The cavern was enormous, its rough rock walls partially covered with concrete. A string of bare industrial light bulbs cast a sickly yellow glow over the scene. In the center of the cavern, hundreds of barrels were stacked in neat, terrifying rows. Some were new and clean, while others were rusted and weeping dark, viscous fluid onto the floor, which was stained with years of spills. A network of pipes ran along the ceiling, and the low hum of an unseen ventilation system was the only sound. "My God," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with horror. "This is bigger than Daniel ever imagined." Jake's light swept across the cavern until it found what they were looking for. Against the far wall, a small prefabricated office stood like a watchtower, a large glass window facing the stacks of barrels. It was the operations nerve center. They moved quickly and silently across the concrete floor, Valor sticking so close to Jake he was practically attached to his leg. The office door was unlocked. Inside, the air was slightly cleaner. It was a simple, functional space containing two metal desks, a filing cabinet, and a desktop computer humming quietly on one of the desks. "This is it," Sarah said, her journalist's instincts taking over. She pulled a small, black portable hard drive and a cable from the pockets of her jacket. If there are records, they'll be here. Get to it, Jake said, positioning himself at the door to keep watch. Be fast. Sarah sat at the computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The system was old, with no password protection. The arrogance of the criminals was their greatest weakness. She found what she was looking for almost immediately. Files labeled manifests, shipments, payments. It was all there. A digital ledger of an environmental catastrophe. She plugged in the hard drive and initiated the transfer. A small progress bar appeared on the screen, a thin green line that began to crawl from left to right with agonizing slowness. It's a lot of data, she said, her voice tense. It's going to take a few minutes. While the files copied, she pulled out her phone. There was no signal down here, of course, but she could prepare. She opened her email app and began to compose a message, attaching a small encrypted file of her brother's initial findings. The recipient was already in her contacts, Agent Miller, FBI. He was the only person in law enforcement she trusted, the agent who had been assigned Daniel's cold case months ago and had shown a flicker of genuine interest, even when local authorities had dismissed her. The data now downloading onto the hard drive would be the proof he needed to finally act. She saved the message as a draft, ready to be sent the moment she got a signal. 90%, she announced, her eyes glued to the screen. Jake nodded, his body a study in controlled tension. He could hear the hum of the fans, the drip of some unknown liquid in the main cavern, the sound of his own breathing. It felt like an eternity. Done, Sarah said, relief washing over her voice. She safely ejected the hard drive and slipped it into her pocket. It felt warm to the touch, a small vessel of devastating truth. Let's get out of here. They turned to leave the small office, their mission accomplished. But in their haste, Sarah's boot caught on the edge of a worn rubber mat in front of the door. As she stumbled, her weight shifted, pressing down hard on the corner of the mat. A faint click sounded from beneath the floorboards. It was a tiny sound, almost imperceptible, but to Jake's trained ears, it was as loud as a gunshot. He froze, his blood running cold, his eyes shot to the floor. A pressure sensor. A silent alarm. Miles away, in the quiet office of the Blue Ridge County Sheriff's Department, a small, black receiver box sat on the edge of Sheriff Thompson's desk. For a year, it had remained dormant. Now a single red light on its surface began to blink, a silent, insistent pulse in the dim light of the office. Thompson, who had been reviewing paperwork, stopped cold. His head snapped up, his cold blue eyes fixing on the blinking light. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. The rats had finally entered the trap. Back in the cavern, Jake looked at Sarah, the terrible knowledge passing between them without a word. They had the evidence, but in getting it, they had tripped the wire. He could almost feel the unseen hunter turning his gaze in their direction. The hunt had officially begun. Run, Jake said, his voice a harsh rasp. The single word was not a suggestion. It was a command forged in the crucible of life-or-death situations. They scrambled up the concrete steps, bursting out of the cold, chemical-laced darkness and into the cool, clean air of the twilight forest. They didn't pause to close the heavy hatch. There was no time. Thompson knew. He would be coming. The race back to the cabin was a blur of pounding feet and ragged breaths. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs aching, but Jake's steady presence just ahead of her, and Valor's silent form, scouting the path before them, kept her moving. The familiar woods were now an alien landscape, every shadow a potential ambush, every sound a possible threat. They burst into the clearing and slammed the cabin door shut just as the last of the daylight bled from the sky. Sarah leaned against the door, gasping for air, her body trembling. But Jake was already in motion. The veteran had taken over completely, his actions swift and purposeful. The panic that had threatened to consume Sarah was held at bay by the sheer force of his focus. "The table," he ordered. "Help me." Together, they shoved the heavy oak dining table against the front door, creating a solid barricade. "The windows are the weak points," he said, thinking aloud as he moved through the small space. He dragged a heavy chest of drawers in front of the large window in the main room. "It won't stop them, but it will slow them down. It will make noise." He handed her a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the kitchen. "Stay away from the windows. If anyone gets in, you swing for the head. Don't hesitate." Sarah stared at the skillet in her hands. It felt absurdly heavy. Her life had been about words and ideas, and now her survival depended on a piece of cookware. She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Jake placed Valor in the darkest corner of the room, behind a worn armchair. The dog seemed to understand instinctively. He lay down, his body low to the ground, a silent predator waiting in the shadows. "Watch, Val," Jake whispered, a final command. Just as he finished his preparations, they heard it. The sound of multiple vehicles rumbling up the gravel driveway. Headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the cabin walls like searchlights before the engines were cut. Doors opened and closed. Jake peered through a small gap in the curtains. He could make out at least 4 figures spreading out, forming a loose perimeter around the cabin. They were dressed in the uniforms of Blue Ridge County Sheriff's deputies. They were using the color of law to mask a criminal siege. One of them was Sheriff Thompson himself, directing his men with quiet hand signals. "Brooks," Thompson's voice called out, amplified by the night silence. "I know you're in there, and I know what you found. Make it easy on yourselves. Come on out." "Aiden checked." Jake remained silent. He picked up the only weapon he had, a long, heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a small comfort in his hands. Minutes stretched into an eternity. They heard the deputies testing the windows, rattling the doorknob against the barricade. They were assessing the defenses, looking for a weakness. The psychological pressure was immense, a waiting game designed to break their nerve. Then, the assault came. A loud bang on the front door served as a diversion, drawing their attention. In the same instant, a crash of shattering glass erupted from the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. It was the one window Jake hadn't been able to fully barricade. "Stay here," Jake yelled at Sarah as he moved toward the bedroom door. But it was too late. A man dressed in a deputy's uniform scrambled through the broken window. He was younger than the others, with a cruel, eager look on his face. He saw Sarah before he saw Jake. With 2 quick strides, he crossed the room and grabbed her, yanking her back against him, his thick arm locking around her throat. "Don't move," the deputy snarled at Jake, who had frozen in the bedroom doorway. "Or she gets hurt." Sarah struggled, kicking backward, but his grip was like iron. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her. This was it. This was how it ended. But the deputy had made a critical mistake. In his rush to secure the hostage, he had forgotten the third member of their team. He had forgotten about the silent gray shadow in the corner of the room. From behind the armchair, Valor exploded into action. He was not a barking, growling pet. He was a trained weapon system. One moment he was a hidden shape in the darkness. The next, he was a 75-pound missile of focused fury. There was only the sound of claws scrabbling for purchase on the wooden floor, and a deep, terrifying snarl that came from the pit of his chest. The deputy had no time to react. Valor launched himself into the air, his powerful body colliding with the man's side. The impact threw the deputy off balance, his grip on Sarah loosening for a critical second. Before he could recover, Valor's jaws clamped down on his arm, the one holding Sarah. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony. He let go of Sarah completely, trying to fight off the dog. Jake surged forward. He swung the iron poker in a short, brutal arc, striking the deputy hard on the side of the head. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by Sarah's ragged sobs and Valor's low, warning growl as he stood over the downed man, his body still trembling with adrenaline. Jake rushed to Sarah's side. "Are you okay?" he asked, his hands checking her for injuries. She nodded, still trying to catch her breath. her eyes wide with terror and a dawning sense of awe as she stared at the dog. Valor had not just saved her. He had, in a single, decisive act of loyalty and courage, completely turned the tide of the battle. They had been losing. Now, they had a hostage, and they had hope. The longest night was not over, but they had survived its first, most brutal assault. The silence in the cabin was a taut, fragile thing, broken only by Sarah's ragged breathing and the unconscious deputy's shallow groans. Jake moved quickly, using a roll of duct tape from his toolkit to bind the man's hands and feet, a grim expression on his face. This small victory had bought them a moment, nothing more. Thompson knew one of his men was down, and the next assault would be overwhelming. Hiding was no longer an option. "The email," Jake said, his voice low and urgent as he turned to Sarah. "You said you have an email ready for the FBI." Sarah nodded, clutching the hard drive in her pocket. "It's ready, but there's no signal. Not a single bar anywhere in this valley." Jake's mind raced, his tactical brain sorting through the limited, desperate options. Then, an image surfaced, a memory from his first day exploring the property line. A high, rocky ridge at the northern edge, a place where the trees thinned and the sky opened up. It was their only chance. "There is one place," he said, "the highest point on this property. If we can get a signal anywhere, it'll be up there." Sarah looked at him, the terrifying reality of his plan dawning on her. "They're right outside, Jake. We'll never make it." "We will," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He looked at Valor, who was licking a small scrape on his leg, his body still thrumming with adrenaline but ready for the next command. "They expect us to cower in here. They expect us to be prey. We're going to be the storm they didn't see coming." His plan was desperate, a single, bold stroke. He threw a heavy log onto the fire, followed by a piece of the broken armchair. Then he opened the fireplace flue just enough to let thick, choking smoke begin to fill the room, but not enough to let the flames roar. "It's a screen," he explained, leading Sarah toward the back of the cabin. "They'll think the cabin's on fire. It'll cause confusion." They slipped out through the broken bedroom window, melting into the pitch blackness of the forest. Behind them, smoke began to billow from the chimney, creating the perfect diversion. Shouts erupted from the men surrounding the cabin as they reacted to the unexpected development. Their escape into the woods was a desperate, stumbling flight through the darkness. Jake led the way, relying on his night vision and an innate sense of the terrain. Sarah stayed close behind, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hand gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. Valor was a gray ghost at their side, his senses their best defense. He would freeze, a low growl in his chest, warning them of a nearby deputy, and they would flatten themselves to the ground until the flashlight beam passed. The climb to the ridge was brutal. They scrambled up the steep, muddy incline, pulling themselves up by roots and rocks. The sounds of pursuit were never far behind, the angry shouts of Thompson's men echoing through the trees. They knew their quarry had escaped the cabin, and now the hunt was on in earnest. Finally, they broke through the tree line and onto the summit. It was a windswept, rocky outcrop, exposed under the cold light of the moon. But as Sarah looked at her phone, a gasp of hope escaped her lips. A single, flickering bar of signal. "I've got it," she said, her fingers flying across the screen. "It's weak. I'm starting the upload." Jake took his position at the edge of the ridge, the iron poker his only weapon. "Val, watch," he commanded. The dog stood beside him, a silent sentinel, his eyes scanning the darkness below from which their enemies would emerge. The progress bar on Sarah's phone was a thin sliver of hope, crawling across the screen at an agonizingly slow pace. Below them, they could see the beams of flashlights converging on their position. "They're coming," Jake warned. The first deputy scrambled over the rocks, a large man with a pistol in his hand. Jake met him with a ferocious charge, using the poker like a club, striking the man's hand and sending the gun clattering into the darkness. He shoved the man backward, sending him tumbling back down the incline. but another was right behind him. Sarah cried out as a second deputy appeared to her left, his face a mask of cold fury. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim, not at Jake, but at her, the source of their problem. Jake was too far away, tangled with the first man. "Sarah, move!" he yelled, a wave of cold dread washing over him. He was too late. But Valor was not. With a roar that was pure protective fury, Valor launched himself forward. He was not aiming for the man's arm, but for his center mass, a gray blur of motion under the moonlight. The deputy, startled, fired his weapon. The gunshot ripped through the night air, deafening and final. A pained cry was torn from Valor's throat as the bullet slammed into his shoulder, but his momentum did not stop. He collided with the deputy with the force of a battering ram, his weight and power sending the man crashing backward onto the rocks. The deputy's head struck a stone with a sickening crack, and he lay still. Sarah screamed Valor's name, tears streaming down her face as she saw him stagger, his front leg slick with blood. He had intercepted the bullet meant for her. He had saved her life. In the midst of the chaos, her thumb, still pressed to her phone screen, felt a single, distinct vibration. She glanced down through her tears. 2 words glowed on the screen, a beacon in the terrifying darkness. Upload complete. The email was gone. The evidence was sent. Their signal of life, paid for in loyalty and blood, was on its way. The remaining deputy advanced on them, his face a snarl of fury. Jake pushed Sarah behind him, his body a weary but unbroken shield. He held the iron poker, his knuckles white, ready to meet the final, hopeless charge. Valor, whimpering in pain, tried to struggle to his feet, his loyalty overriding the fire in his shoulder. This was the end. A last, desperate stand on a lonely mountaintop. Then, a new sound cut through the night. It began as a faint, rhythmic chopping, a pulse from far away. It grew steadily louder, deeper, a sound that did not belong to the mountains. It was the sound of machinery, of power, of intervention. A brilliant white light suddenly speared down from the heavens, drenching their rocky stage in an artificial daylight that made them squint. The deputy froze, his head snapping upward. High above them, a black helicopter hung in the night sky like a vengeful angel. As it circled, another set of lights appeared on the ground below, the telltale red and blue of law enforcement, swarming the base of the ridge. FBI, a voice boomed from a loudspeaker on the helicopter, impossibly loud and clear. Drop your weapons. You are surrounded. For the deputies, the world had turned upside down. They were no longer the hunters, they were the cornered prey. Figures in black tactical gear moved with terrifying speed and efficiency through the trees below. Their professionalism, a stark contrast to Thompson's brutal force. The siege was broken in minutes. Sheriff Thompson and his men, caught completely by surprise, surrendered without a fight. On the ridge, Jake finally allowed himself to collapse to his knees, not from injury, but from sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. Agents swarmed their position, securing the scene. A medic immediately rushed to their side, but Jake just pointed a shaking hand at his partner. "My dog," he said, his voice cracking. "Help my dog." The medic, seeing the gunshot wound, immediately went to work on Valor, applying pressure to the bleeding, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone. Sarah knelt beside them, stroking Valor's head, tears of relief and grief tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. As they worked, a man in a suit, his face all business, approached them. "Mr. Brooks, Miss Jensen," he said, "I'm Agent Miller. We got your email. The evidence is definitive. You did good work here tonight. Incredibly brave work." But Jake's attention was only on Valor, who was being carefully loaded onto a stretcher to be airlifted to a veterinary trauma center. He had done his duty. He had saved them. He had been their signal of life. 3 months later, a gentle autumn breeze swept through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and turning leaves. The oppressive, watchful silence of the mountains had been replaced by a genuine peace. The land was healing. Down by the creek, A team from the Environmental Protection Agency was in the final stages of a massive cleanup operation. The barrels were gone, the poisoned soil excavated, and the underground cavern was being permanently sealed with concrete. The shadow had been lifted. On the porch of the cabin, Valor, now fully recovered, chased a tennis ball that Sarah had thrown. He ran with the sheer, unadulterated joy of a dog who was simply happy to be alive. A faint, silver scar on his shoulder, the only remaining sign of that longest night. Jake watched him, a rare, easy smile on his face. He sat beside Sarah on the porch swing, their shoulders touching. In the months since the raid, a quiet, unshakable bond had formed between them. They had walked through the fire together and emerged on the other side, changed. The federal prosecutor says Thompson and his crew will be going away for a very long time, Sarah said, leaning her head against his shoulder. The corporation they were working for is facing a mountain of charges. Your testimony and Daniel's journal were the final nails in the coffin. Justice had been served. Her brother's memory had been honored. But it was not an ending. It was a beginning. "I've been thinking," Jake said, his voice thoughtful as he watched Valor pounce on the ball. "About this place. About what to do with it now." He had come here seeking a sanctuary for himself, a place to hide from the world, to silence the ghosts in his head. But the events of that night had taught him something. You couldn't build a wall high enough to keep the world out. The only true sanctuary was one you built with others. The only true peace was one you shared. "This land has seen so much poison, so much pain," he continued. "It feels wrong for it to just be for me. I was thinking, maybe it could be a place of healing for other vets, guys like me, who just need a quiet place to find their footing again." Sarah lifted her head, her eyes shining with a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. "A new dawn," she whispered, understanding completely. "A sanctuary, not just for one, but for many." She smiled, a real, brilliant smile that transformed her face. "I think Daniel would have loved that." Jake looked out over the valley, at the mountains standing guard in the distance. He had come here to lose himself, but instead, he had found everything that mattered. He had found a partner whose courage matched his own. He had found a renewed sense of purpose, a mission that went beyond mere survival. And he had confirmed what he already knew, that the loyalty of a good dog was one of the most powerful forces in the universe. Sarah slipped her hand into his. Valor, tiring of his game, trotted back to the porch and rested his head on Jake's knee, his amber eyes content. The three of them sat together in the quiet of the afternoon, a small, unlikely family forged in darkness, now looking forward, together, into the light of their new dawn. It is a profound truth that the deepest loyalty is often found not in words, but in the silent, steady presence of an animal at our side. Valor's story reminds us that even in our darkest nights, we are never truly alone when a faithful friend is watching over us. If you were touched by his courage and believe in the power of these unbreakable bonds, we invite you to join our community. Share your thoughts in the comments below and help these stories reach more hearts by leaving a like and subscribing. The journey doesn't have to end here, as another unforgettable tale of courage has just appeared on your screen. Click to continue exploring the incredible connections that shape our lives.